Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest will take us into a disturbing and sadly relevant topic that seems to make up the belief system of a lot of folks in the current administration and a lot of folks scheming for power by various means. We are recording this on November 19th, and news just broke earlier today that there was a very sketchy indictment process of James Comey, which is, in my mind, as I just said, people are trying to achieve power by any means. Anyway, I don't think we're going to talk about Comey so much this evening, but our guide for this side quest is the author of a new book which covers the topic of white nationalism co-opting the classics and its disturbing presence in American culture. The title of that book is The White Pedestal: How White Nationalists Use Ancient Greece and Rome to Justify Hate. We were initially scheduled to do this interview earlier, but due to family illnesses transporting themselves from one family to another, we postponed it, which not great that someone was sick. However, it was good. It was helpful in the sense that I was able to read all of this book and enjoyed it thoroughly. It is now out for purchase, so I recommend that you buy it, read it. You will learn a lot. You will probably be unsettled by what you learn. There's a lot to unpack there. As I mentioned, our guide for this next side quest is the author of that book, Dr. Curtis Dozier, who is a professor at Vassar College, who has spent a great deal of time detailing just this issue, which we will talk about. He's got a podcast, he's got a website, and he's got a book. So without wasting any further time, Dr. Curtis Dozier, how are you, sir?
I'm great, Ben. Thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm excited to talk to you about the White Pedestal.
Well, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. And I had been trying to reach out to you for a while. And we'll get into this in a little bit more in a minute. I found you through the Mirror of Antiquity podcast. And what I would like to do as your first-time guest here is give you a chance to tell us your classics origin story. So just pretend you're a superhero and tell us your background.
I the exact origin is shrouded in mystery and the mists of time. If we're going to go the superhero route, but in fact, it's as simple as I went to a public high school in Boulder, Colorado, where there was an opportunity to take Latin. And why the eighth grade me chose Latin, I think I'm not prepared to say or understand, except that for a variety of reasons, I hadn't been taking a foreign language in middle school. And so high school was going to be a fresh start in language learning anyway. So, I didn't have a obvious place to go. And so I took Latin. But very quickly, I found that being in Latin class sort of fed. This is me looking back. I don't think I was conscious of this at the time, but looking back, very quickly I found that being in Latin class fed my feeling of intellectual superiority over other people. And certainly my teacher, who I loved and was a very good teacher, fed that as well in the way we thought of ourselves as students and thought of our endeavor to learn this old language with a long and pedigreed symbolic history. And I had a great time in high school doing that. And from there, I continued. I went to a college where Latin was offered, where you could major in classics. So I kept taking courses in college. I studied abroad in Italy as part of that experience, and studying abroad inspired me to um, try to become a professor. Kind of inspired me to pursue the academic life. And I had no idea what that involved. It was a very naive decision at the time. And through a ton of luck, I got to where I am. But I tell the story in that way because through that process, I never really had to question my attraction to this subject because nothing in the way the Latin language or the study of ancient Greek or classical civilizations, nothing in the way any of that was taught or the assumptions that predominated in our classrooms about the value of studying those things, none of that excluded me or challenged my worthiness to study that material or challenged my worthiness to be considered a fully fledged human being. And in a sense, writing this book, one way to understand this book is my journey of coming to recognize that those assumptions about why the ancient world is valuable and worth studying actually do exclude a lot of people and do deny basic humanity to a lot of people. And my journey to understand that dimension of my discipline that I never encountered on my own until it was pointed out to me by many of the people I thank in my acknowledgments, for example.
And one of the things that you talk about, as you were mentioning that, relates to your early studies, and you were told that the Homeric epics deserve special study. They're basically the pinnacle of writing. But that's a value judgment, so you can't really say it's wrong. But as one of the things that I thought was interesting in a way to read this book is somewhat of a confession of, and the more I do this podcast, the more I see it. One of the failures of one of the problems of a lack of interdisciplinary communication, right? Where you said, look, I never went and read some of this other stuff like the Epic of Gilgamesh to see, what else was out there and learn more of it. And if you could just comment on that a little bit, is that part of what you're getting at with the book is, hey, there's a whole other world out there that we also need to be aware of and look at and not just look down our nose upon?
Yes, definitely. That's a part of what I'm saying is that the the world we call the classical world, ancient Greece and Rome, from say the from the Bronze Age to the quote unquote decline and fall of the Roman Empire, has been given a special centrality in both educational curricula and in kind of the symbolic landscape of at least American, although this is true in many other places, American popular culture and self-identity. It's been given a central position in those. And that by giving it a central position, this serves white nationalist politics. And in fact, I would say it was given a central position in order to establish a set of principles for defining our society that are informed by ideas that I would identify as white nationalist ideas in my book. And that one way to resist or subvert or demolish the link between the classical world and white supremacist ideology is, yes, to take away that centrality, to recognize the classical world as just one of many possible world historical cultures that can be studied profitably and that have been important for the development of humanity.
And we've used a couple of terms. I think we should probably define it here, but as I was reading this book, one of the things that occurred to me, is when I have the term classical antiquity in the podcast title, and I'm not going to change that because I've branded it already. So, but I understand there's
It's
sort
a
of a
dirty business, right?
yeah, right. I know. It's I don't make any money off of this, so I'm not going to change it. But there is that's kind of one of the things that you get out in the book is using the term classics is one of these subtle ways that we code certain things, and there's a hidden or maybe not so hidden value judgment associated with that, right?
I mean, it's hidden because the word classical is so naturalized and familiar that I think a lot of people don't think about what it means. Right. So when I say that we've given ancient Greece and Rome a central place, calling the study of ancient Greece and Rome classics or classical studies is one of the ways we give it centrality. If you think about it, the only academic discipline whose name makes a value judgment about the material it studies and teaches is classics. Everything else is descriptive: history, physics, biology, chemistry, psychology, and so on. You can look through the catalog at Vassar and look at the other departments. None of their names make a value judgment about what they study. Whereas the discipline traditionally known as classics or classical studies has a name that declares that the material it treats is of special value. And that's one reason at Vassar, this was just when I started working here, so I can't take credit for this change, but at Vassar in 2010, we changed the name of our department from the Department of Classics to the Department of Greek and Roman Studies because we wanted to have a name that was descriptive rather than made a value judgment about what we teach. And we are not the I don't think we were literally the first to do that, and we're certainly not the only ones to do that, but we were an early one to do that. And I'm very, very proud to teach at a place that did that. Sort of tellingly, though, only a few years after we made that change, the Professional Association of Classical Studies, which since the 19th century was known as the American Philological Association, voted to change its name to the Society for Classical Studies, thereby embracing the value judgment name, actually taking a name, the American Philological Association, which is a little opaque. That's the reason they wanted to get rid of that name. No one outside the organization knew what the American Philological Association did. They got rid of a descriptive name and introduced a name that made a value judgment, going in the opposite direction from us. And I think that's just a kind of index of how tenacious this idea of the special value of Greco-Roman antiquity is, both within the discipline, because to some extent my book is a discussion about disciplinary concerns, but I really try as much as possible, because I think this is what's significant, that the wider public shares that view, even if a lot of the wider public don't know that the discipline is called classical studies, right? Say classical to people, they think of Bach and Beethoven. Some of them might think of classic rock. We have a lot of classic cars. We have a lot of things that are classical in the United States. But most people know that if something is classic or classical, it has a kind of special claim to admiration. And a lot of people learn to have a special admiration for ancient Greece and Rome, even if they don't know that much about it. And it's that widespread admiration, whether it comes from teachers in school, professors like me, or whether it comes from the representation of ancient Greece and Rome in film, video games, popular media of any kind, doesn't matter where it comes from, that special admiration that so many people have for Greco-Roman antiquity is why white nationalists are so interested in Greco-Roman antiquity, because it makes Greco-Roman antiquity a rhetorically useful tool for white nationalists to make their ideas seem respectable desirable, and even natural and inevitable.
And we've used this term white nationalist a lot. And in the introduction to your book, you throw out a couple of terms that you could have used and decided not to, like white supremacist, alt-right. And you ultimately settled on white nationalist. And we're going to be using that term a lot. So why don't we do good basic study beginning and define our terms so that people understand what particular despicable train of thought we're going to cover in this episode.
Okay, yeah, thanks. The terminology is something I thought a lot about and admit that the solution I chose is not a perfect one. Um, I was committed to not using the term alt-right, although it's a very popular term, very familiar term. Um, but that's a term that was used by white nationalist activists as a to sort of disguise the continuities between what they were claiming in the 2010s and especially in 2015, 2016, 2017 when they were calling themselves the alt-right. That's a term they used to disguise the continuities between their ideas and older style neo-fascist and white supremacist ideas. And so I think now in 2025, we can recognize 2026, when this comes out, we can recognize that alt-right was a euphemism for a form of neo-fascism or white nationalism. So I was committed to not using that term. White supremacist is a term I use in the book, and white supremacy is a term I use in the book, but I understand white supremacy as referring to the pervasive ideology that can be found throughout American society in the way our institutions are structured, in the way resources are distributed, in the way justice is or is not meted out, in all the ways that Americans are taught to think about human difference from childhood, and the way these ideas are reinforced through media, journalism, and so forth. I think we are all in this country steeped in white supremacist ideology, whether we think of ourselves as racists or white supremacists or not. And I think part of our work, and this is one thing I'm trying to contribute to in the book, part of our work as ethical human beings who care about justice and fairness and equity is to become attuned to the way that we are steeped in white supremacist ideology and to figure out in that knowledge how to resist it, critique it, subvert it, and contribute to a more just society. So I think of white supremacy as a sort of large system in which we all are raised and participate and can become aware of to resist and critique. I use the term white nationalist for the people who devote their time and energy to actively maintaining that system, who believe that we should have a society in which white people do better than everyone else. They wouldn't put it that way. They would say that white people do better than everyone else because white people are better than everyone else. That would be their claim. But basically, they think that that's how things should be. And one of the big things I'm trying to do in my book is to introduce readers to these white nationalist activists. These are people with disturbing, shocking, despicable, as you say, views about how society should be structured, but then invite readers to recognize that although we reject and condemn those views, we actually, a lot of us, share a lot of more basic beliefs about human difference, about the way society should be structured. We share a lot of more basic beliefs with those white nationalist activists because we've absorbed those beliefs from the white supremacist context we live in. And I think Greco-Roman antiquity is a productive way to make that link between overt white nationalism and the pervasive white supremacy of our culture, because Greco-Roman antiquity is such a common touchstone in our culture, and one that has so often been used to establish and propagate white supremacist ideas. So many people have absorbed beliefs about Greco-Roman antiquity, and the white nationalist activists I write about provide an opportunity to examine, maybe for the first time, those beliefs about antiquity critically. And when we do that, I think we can also examine critically the beliefs that antiquity has been used to promote.
And you're talking about the pervasiveness of white nationalist ideology. I don't think we have to go any further than recent Supreme Court opinions to see that take hold as an attorney. That hits home for me, the concept of Kavanaugh stops,
Mhm.
the green lighting that Kavanaugh wrote about allowing government people. Remember, due process applies to persons, not just citizens. That's a big distinction. But saying basically it's okay for the government to make brief investigative stops to check the immigration status of those who gather in locations where people are hired for day jobs. There's race-based and ethnic-based assumptions there, who work or appear to work in jobs such as construction, landscaping, agricultural, or car washes that often do not require paperwork and are therefore attractive to illegal immigrants. Again, ethnic, race-based judgments there, and who do not speak much, if any, English. That's extremely loaded, and should show you how pervasive that thought process is. I try not to editorialize too much about current events, but it's sort of hard not to given the topic. So um, when you're thinking about what ICE is doing, keep in mind that there's a Supreme Court justice who wrote an opinion that basically says non-English speaking people do not belong in the country, and there's a presumption they don't belong here. And I think that goes very much to the point that your book is making, uh, about how pervasive these ideas are. Now,
And I would just add to that, we didn't end up with Kavanaugh on this. I mean, let me try to put it positively. We have Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court making the decisions he made because the ideas underlying that are so widely accepted and have been for so long. What we're seeing now is and this isn't original to me, is the sort of emergence out into the open of ideas that have been widespread and uh, you know generally accepted in this country for a long time.
well, and as you write this book, again, we mentioned the Mirror of Antiquity, and you have a website, Pharos, which I started learning about getting ready for this. And there's an article that I would commend to a lot of people on there that I was reading before we started recording this about Megyn Kelly and Rahm Emanuel. Read it. I don't know where to begin with Megyn Kelly, so I'm not going to, but or Rahm Emanuel. But tell us a little bit about how those two projects came about, and what you're still doing, Pharos, obviously, but tell us how those projects came about.
So the Mirror Antiquity is a podcast I did for a few years, interviewing classical scholars about the relationship between their research on the ancient world and the contemporary world and their own lives. Um, I haven't been active. That project hasn't been active, but the episodes I did record are online, and I hope to keep them there a long time at themirrorofantiquity.com and on any podcast app. Um, that podcast came out of a desire to speak to a broader public about classical scholarship and to acknowledge the personal dimension of the work that we as scholars do, the way that our personal experience informs the things we're interested in antiquity, and to invite listeners to think about how the study of Greco-Roman antiquity relates to their individual experiences. So you could call that a podcast about classical reception. That's a subfield of classical studies. Get a little technical here, but there's a subfield of classical studies called classical reception studies or reception studies, which is about the ways that ancient Greece and Rome have been used in time periods other than the ancient world as part of political arguments, as part of artistic movements. It's a subfield that studies adaptation, that studies translation, that studies what we sometimes call the classical tradition, the influence of Greco-Roman antiquity on later institutions. That's classical reception studies. And when Vassar changed its name from the Department of Classics to the Department of Greek and Roman Studies, there was also a curricular change, which was that we made reception studies a central part of our curriculum. And we did that because the name wasn't just a sort of superficial change of our wrapper or our brand. we actually wanted to be a meaningful intellectual change that would recognize the sort of political and historical situatedness of the study of antiquity. So that instead of having a value judgment classics, we're going to have a descriptive name Greek and Roman studies, and we were going to stop assuming that classics was universal or timeless or always beneficial in its influence. We're going to start studying critically the ways antiquity had been used in different times and places. And my podcast came out of my experience teaching in that curriculum. So that's the podcast. I'm very proud of the work I did on that, and maybe someday I'll get back to it. But basically, my other project that you referred to, Pharaohs, my website Pharaohs, sort of took off so much that I ended up feeling like I needed to devote my time to that. But it's related in that what Pharaohs is a website where I document examples of hate groups online mostly using ancient Greece and Rome in support of their hateful politics. It's basically the website where I did the research for the material that I treat in the book we're discussing today. And I launched that website in 2017. I was inspired to launch it by an article written by Donna Zuckerberg, who's Mark Zuckerberg's sister. She has a PhD in classics, and at that time she ran an online journal for classics and contemporary culture called Eidolon. And those articles are all still available. And pretty shortly after the first election of Donald Trump, she wrote an article called How to Be a Good Classicist Under a Bad Emperor. And in that article, she called attention to the ways that the online movement that at that time we were calling the alt-right, was drawing inspiration from ancient Greece and Rome. And that was a phenomenon that I knew nothing about. I was not aware of it. This is why I say I had never had to encounter anything that excluded me. I think this was true of many white classicists, is I knew nothing about this phenomenon. And so reading her article was quite surprising to me, because I think I had a very idealized view of what classics meant and could mean. Even though I had been teaching in this reception-based curriculum for a while, I had a very idealistic view of what classics could mean. And her article really called my attention to a much more disturbing and violent and oppressive set of receptions of classical antiquity. That's why I bring up reception theories, because I think when I read that article, I saw, teaching in a reception-based curriculum, I saw, oh, these are people who are using classics for political purposes in a period after antiquity. And so I was very interested in that. And it sort of fit with my interest in my podcast around, how does the personal and by extension, the political come into play in our relation to Greco-Roman antiquity. So I started looking into this more, and that looking into it more led to me launching this website to document examples of it. I launched it that article came out in 2016. I did some work over the next year trying to figure out how to do it, get some support from my institution. And I launched the website, which you can find at doingjusticetotheclassics.org or pharaohsclassics.org. I have both registered. And since 2017, I've been, in different years, I write more or less. I've been writing a little less since I worked on the book, but I've written a lot of articles about examples I've found of hate groups using Greco-Roman antiquity in support of their politics. And I had no idea what was going to happen. I, didn't know where it would go, but the pages have been viewed by more than 500,000 readers from 180 countries around the world, which is most of the world. And that just blows my mind that, it's reached such a wide audience for what's a pretty niche classics site, right? It shows me that it's not just classics professors and their students reading it. And I've gotten a lot of press and a lot of interest in that work. And that ultimately led to my book. But it's sort of linked to the podcast in that it's about the ways that ancient Greece and Rome is used by contemporary thinkers in political ways. It just happens to be a set of contemporary thinkers that I think most people would prefer not to think about, would prefer to sort of ignore and act like they don't exist. But you bring up Megyn Kelly. When I launched the site in 2017, I was writing about fringe websites and people operating on the edges of American political life. And now I can write about Megyn Kelly, who invoked the Roman Empire to claim that America is on the brink of collapse because of moral degeneracy related to transgender people in her worldview. Megyn Kelly is not a fringe figure. She's a she's been named one of the most influential people in the world. Um, she she's so popular. She doesn't just have a show on SiriusXM. She's got a whole channel on SiriusXM. You can listen to Megyn Kelly all day long if you want. And she is talking about ancient Rome in connection with transphobia and other and xenophobia and other hateful politics. So it's not just fringe people anymore, but people in the center of American political life. I wrote about Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, third in line to the presidency. He, in an earlier interview, claimed that the Roman Empire fell because of homosexuality. Um, we of course have Elon Musk. I've written a couple articles about Elon Musk. I've got a lot more I could write about Elon Musk, and I hope to write about Elon Musk, the wealthiest man in the world, one of the most powerful men in the world. He loves Greco-Roman antiquity and uses it to support his particular breed of xenophobic far-right politics. It's not just fringe people I'm writing about. It's very powerful, influential people now, and that's a shift I've seen just in the time I've been working on the site.
Yeah, and it's interesting and unsettling. Obviously Stephen Miller comes up, shocker. But when I was reading your book, I was surprised how long it took you to get to Pat Buchanan. And for younger viewers, you may not remember Pat Buchanan because he got kicked off of MSNBC, but he was one of these old, the polite term was paleo conservative, really extreme, hard right wing guys, but who was very intellectual and I guess he could hold an audience on TV. He was on Crossfire. He was on CNN for a long time. He was on MSNBC for a long time, but he was always kind of full of hatred and bile, really, if you boiled him down to his essence. And I just, he was on a website called VDare, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit. But was he one of the early white nationalist thinkers who broke into the what we might call the modern TV and political ecosphere?
I I appreciate that question. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that. You'd really need a true historian of hate and extremism, whereas I'm kind of a historian of one little part of hate and extremism, if that makes sense.
Right.
I do think that's right. I mean, there's some interesting news reporting about Pat Buchanan as a precursor to Trump's campaign. There are many similarities in the sort of xenophobic populism and kind of open affirmation of white grievance in both of their campaigns. This is Pat Buchanan running for president in the early 90s. So I think that's right that he's one of the the way I would put it, my sense is that he's one of the first people to articulate pretty explicit white nationalist ideas in the political mainstream, if that makes sense. But I think that earlier you would find plenty of white nationalist ideas being dressed up in more respectable sounding language in earlier periods of the modern media cycle. Right. But I do think he is a person who did it on a bigger stage and more explicitly maybe than anyone had before. And I brought him up in my book when I did because I kind of saw him mainly as a theorist of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and so I sort of slotted him into that chapter rather than as a kind of central figure in the book. And in a sense, when I wrote the book, he was kind of past his most productive period, if you want to say. He's retired now. He's quite elderly. He's not writing anymore, publicly at least. But you're right. He's a major figure in this history, and he's someone who cared a lot about ancient Greece and Rome, and uh, read a lot about it and referred to it a lot as part of his arguments that um, women having political and sexual freedom was destroying America, as part of his arguments that immigration was destroying America, and just his general belief in kind of the moral decay of America. Rome was an important touchstone for him in both his kind of published books, in many cases published by mainstream presses, and also his writing for extremist websites.
And what is it, that last part about his reliance on antiquity, what is it about antiquity and the classics that sucks in the white nationalist crowd and the white nationalist thinkers? Why is it that they rely on that as opposed to other periods of time?
In a sense, this is one of the central things I'm trying to make people aware of in my book, which is that ancient Greece and Rome are practically is are perfectly designed for use by white nationalist activists. Why do they use ancient Greece and Rome? Why do they use history? Why do they use anything? White nationalist activists are interested in making white supremacist ideas respected, or I should say, they're interested in making white supremacist ideas respectable, um, and desirable, and even natural, seem respectable, desirable, and natural. Because they understand that if in a democratic society where there are elections, that if large numbers of people accept the respective or feel that white nationalist ideas are respectable, then they're going to vote in ways that reflect the respectability of their perceived respectability of those ideas. And so they are engaged in a process of changing the culture, or at least or creating a national culture in which white supremacist ideas are respectable, in the idea that that will lead to electoral and political success. That before you can pass laws, um, enforce policy, have ICE dragging people out of their homes and throwing them into concentration camps, before you can have any of that, people have to be willing to vote for that and believe that those ideas are desirable and respectable. So they're interested in anything that can make white supremacist ideas respectable. So they're looking for the ideal kind of rhetorical tools for them are things that are both respected and at least adjacent or congenial to white supremacist ideas. And Greco-Roman antiquity has both of those. We've already said on this show, it's very respected. A lot of people look at the ancient world and think of it as a high, sophisticated civilization. They think of it as the foundation of the modern world, of modern liberalism. They think of Athens as the birthplace of democracy. You said it in the opening of your show, the what is it? The glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome, right? That's a phrase that just encapsulates, the admiration for the ancient world. So here we have this very admired period of history. Many people admire it. And the reason I say it's ready-made for white nationalist activism is that the ancient sources, ancient writers actually articulate a lot of ideas that are very similar to or identical to white nationalist beliefs about how society should be organized. To just name a few examples, Plato in his Republic, characters in the Republic describing this ideal city say that when a deformed child is born, it should be taken away and put in a dark place where no one ever sees it again. They say that the state should control who can reproduce with whom so that the offspring are, as beneficial as possible to the state. Basically, it's recommending eugenic programs that fascist regimes throughout the 20th century were interested in. Aristotle, major philosophical mind has a passage where he talks about all these examples. He says we don't actually have enough information to evaluate really whether it's true what he's saying, but Aristotle basically says, here's a list of cities that incorporated foreigners into their societies, and it led to civil war, strife, destruction, and violence. Aristotle basically says, do not do that. Keep foreigners out of your society. And the white nationalists know this. They know. Here we have Aristotle, one of the most respected philosophical minds in history, saying that admitting foreigners into your society will destroy it. So if they want to make that idea respectable, they just have to say, here's Aristotle, this philosopher you've heard of. You probably think of him as one of the smartest people ever. Guess what he said about immigration? Guess what he said about granting citizenship rights to outsiders? He said it's very dangerous and destructive to your society. That's what we say. We're not saying anything fringy or far right. We're saying something very traditional, respectable, time-honored, articulated by one of the greatest minds in human history. Now, when you put it as baldly as that, when you say, because Aristotle said this, it must be true, it's almost laughable, right? It's almost laughable, the logical fallacy, because this person you think is smart said something, it must be true. But when you're talking about Greco-Roman antiquity, that's the normal way of thinking about Greco-Roman antiquity. Think about all the people who talk about classical wisdom or the wisdom of the ancients, or how we study the past to learn about ourselves and the future. There's this assumption that the ancient world contains ideas worth taking seriously. And in fact, a lot of those ideas are basically white nationalist ideas. And so classical antiquity is ready-made for white nationalists to try to make their ideas seem respectable and desirable. So you asked, why do they use it instead of other time periods? It's because they're interested in the most respected time periods that have the most connections with white nationalist thought. And other time periods that they're interested in, medieval Europe, the kind of Vikings, and so on, those work pretty well for them also, and so they use those a lot. One reason they're very interested in genetic science is because the discipline of genetics has a very tangled history with racist pseudoscience, and the category of biological science is very respected, and so they're very interested in genetics as a source of legitimacy for their ideas. But Greco-Roman antiquity is up there as having both the respectability and the inherent white nationalist ideas for them. There's one little anecdote. I know this is a long answer, but there's one anecdote that's not in the book that I'll just share.
Don't worry, because the podcast title is Sidequest. So
okay, yeah, right. We're going to Sidequest of the Sidequest
right
here, but I think this is relevant. There's an organization I refer to in the book called Identity Europa, which in kind of 2017 and 2018 was terrorizing college campuses, leaving flyers, it's a white supremacist organization that was recruiting on college campuses, terrorizing communities with their flyers. And some of their flyers were images of classical sculptures that with white supremacist slogans along with them. And they changed their name, eventually became the American Identity Movement, but they had their national conference in front of the Parthenon in Nashville, the Nashville model of the Parthenon and everything. So they're very interested in Greco-Roman antiquity. Well, this hacker group, Unicorn Riot, got a hold of their Discord chats, of the internal chats of this group, Identity Europa. And I had one of my research assistants go through this release of all these Discord chats, and there were a lot of references to Greco-Roman antiquity in them, including people with usernames, avatars of images of classical sculpture, all this stuff. But there was one little exchange that really stood out to me, which was one member was asking, they were basically asking why all this classical antiquity stuff, wouldn't Germanic kind of Nordic myths be better for what we're trying to claim about the superiority of white people? And somebody responded, yes, Norse mythology would be better for us, but Greco-Roman antiquity is so respected that it's more useful rhetorically, basically. And I think that's your answer. They don't really care about ancient Greece and Rome. They care about making their own ideas respectable. And they're going to use anything that is respectable and that contains that is ready-made or contains white nationalist ideas. And in a sense, that's kind of something I'm trying to raise awareness about in my book, is just how much in Greco-Roman antiquity there is that lends itself to the use of white nationalists. I really reject this idea of the abuse of history or the misappropriation of history or the distortion of history. And there are examples of white nationalists who make up stuff or misquote things or, you know, misrepresent history. But the people I'm really interested in, the people I focus on in my book, they don't have to do that. They know that there's plenty of authentic ancient Greco-Roman material that suits their political purposes very well. And they have done the research to find those things, and they use them, I think, as the current situation shows, to great effect.
Yeah, it's interesting though. Yeah, one of the themes we keep coming back to on this podcast is history is messy and it's complicated, and people's willingness to forget that part of it I find interesting. I I don't know, but you were talking about the eugenics movement, and again, you don't have to look very far in this country to see how pervasive that was at one
Mhm.
time. There is a Supreme Court opinion, which we studied in law school, Buck v. Bell, written by, I think this was a concurrence. I don't remember. Well, he may have written the actual opinion itself. I could be mistaken. Or it
Yeah,
may
I'm
have
not
been.
familiar with this. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I can't remember if it's the majority opinion or if it's a concurrence. Regardless, it's very famous, but it was a eugenics case. It was a forced sterilization case. Uh, there was an attempt, I think it was in Virginia, to sterilize a woman, and uh, the Supreme Court allowed it. They let it go forward, and in Justice Holmes' opinion, he wrote, uh, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." And that was part of his reasoning to allow that to go
Hmm.
forward. And as I'm reading this here, it was the majority opinion. But again, that is um, that is something that is there in an opinion, and I think that it is something that people need to keep in mind about how uh, widespread these views become. And granted, people have moved away from that, but again, it's very pervasive. Another thing that you talk about with the
Actually, let me just say two things about eugenics. I mean, I mentioned this in my book. There's a prize-winning essay at Oxford published in the early part of the 20th century called Ancient Eugenics, which is basically a collection of all the ancient authors that talk about infanticide and controlling reproduction and the need to do those things, which was completely contributing to the eugenics movement. Again, this is an Oxford University prize-winning essay um, that shows how central the eugenics movement was to intellectual thought at that time. And then also, this is something I'd like to research more, although I refer to it in the book, is of course, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, very strong supporter of eugenics movements, very paranoid about what we would now call white genocide. He called it race suicide. But he wrote a lot about the decline of civilization as a result of race mixing and sort of dysgenic, what he saw as dysgenic practices. And he made some references to ancient Greece and Rome in doing that. So to your point about the centrality of these ideas in the early part of the 20th century, um, yes, they were central. You find the Supreme Court endorsing them, and you find classics there, as is often the case.
and if you do get time, it's been a long time since I've looked at this, but there was some follow up on Miss Buck's life after that, and you get a whole different perspective to
Yeah,
it. There's a lot out there, but I would commend everyone to take some time to look at the Buck v. Bell opinion. It's from, I think, pulling up now, 1927.
yeah,
So take a look
yeah.
at
Thanks
that.
for that.
And one thing, it's a side because I studied Sidequest a little bit. I did study uh, American history in college. and I had a very good professor who talked about some of the messier aspects of the concept of the melting pot that we
Mm.
have in America, and the views that the upper classes held towards the lower classes, and the white nationalist folks running to Greece to support their opinions. When Greeks started immigrating here, they were not well liked by the ruling class. So I find the cognitive dissonance there very interesting, and certainly these folks would not probably ally themselves with Greeks today. But that is a whole, we could go on for a long time about that. Um, but the idea of whiteness as a concept that these folks rely on, that is, it's kind of like you're taking a term and applying it retroactively. I mean,
Mhm.
there wasn't really a whiteness in antiquity as the way that we think about it today. Was there? I mean, there was obviously, you know, exclusion efforts and racial beliefs and all
Yeah.
that, but this idea of whiteness, that's the part where I'm really struggling with to make sense of, is these folks are saying we've constructed this weird genealogy of history, right?
Yeah.
Going all the way back to Greece and Rome, that we're somehow the inheritors of this whiteness. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it requires, I think, a kind of subtle or complex treatment. So the claim and this is a whole chapter in my book, a central idea that white nationalist ideology assumes is the biological reality of modern racial categories. That whiteness, blackness in particular, reflect not just they claim not just the genetic differences that produce differences in skin color, but are indicative of many other inescapable and unchangeable genetic differences in physical strength, in mental capacity, in morality, in sexuality, and so on. That's the sort of a central belief of white supremacy, is that race is a biological reality. And genetic science shows that that's not true, that in fact there's more genetic variation between people who share skin color than there is between people who have different skin color and so on. So it's just completely incoherent. The There is, of course, a genetic component in what you look like, but it has nothing to do with anything else about you. That's the genetic reality. But there's a claim in white nationalist circles that race reflects biological reality, and that appearance reflect is a kind of indicator of this biological reality. So what they do with ancient Greece and Rome is they gather all these references to the appearance of famous people in both mythological and historical in the ancient world that corresponds to modern racial categories. So Achilles having blonde hair, Menelaus having red hair, Helen having blonde hair, to name a few mythological examples. Um, Augustus having blue eyes, Hadrian having blue eyes. Um, I can't remember if Sulla is blonde or if he has blue eyes. Anyway, there's
Yeah.
all these references to the appearance of these people, and they say, see, the ancient Greeks and Romans were white because in modern pseudoscientific racial ideologies, having blue eyes and blonde hair tells you something about the morality and intelligence of the people who have that. And so they find those descriptions which exist in ancient material, and they say, see, the ancient Greeks and Romans are the racial ancestors of modern white people, and all the great things that the ancient Greeks and Romans did are a kind of something that modern white people can and should be proud of. So that can be refuted by saying that assumes that makes the modern assumption, the modern pseudoscientific assumption that your skin color reflects other qualities of your character and intellect. So that's what we're saying when we say, well, there was no category of whiteness in antiquity. In fact, they didn't have that assumption. But it, if we want to refute it in that way, we also have to recognize that it's not just modern white nationalist activists who are making that connection, but that's been the normal way to interpret the identity of the Greeks and Romans for several centuries. It's very influential, and I have examples in my book, a few, but there's many others that other scholars have identified where very influential race pseudoscientists who are establishing the modern assumptions about racial identity, the modern lies about racial identity, are using ancient Greece and Rome to do that. So it may be false, but it's actually a completely traditional way to interpret the ancient material. And then the other part we have to realize is that although there wasn't a concept of whiteness in antiquity, there was an assumption that the way you looked was indicative of other features of your character. Now, it's a little ironic that one of those, like whiteness in antiquity, is sort of associated with weakness and effeminacy, for example. So it's not necessarily praiseworthy. But it's the same kind of logic. It's the idea that your appearance tells you something about how you are as a human being. So there's a kind of racializing or racial ideology in antiquity, even if it doesn't line up exactly with ours, that's very useful to contemporary white nationalists. And you can even find ancient texts that associate blackness with violence and frightfulness. Aristotle is pseudo-Aristotelian physiognomic writing and so on. So there are actually certain things that kind of look like modern anti-blackness. Now you can also find Herodotus saying that Ethiopians are the most beautiful people in the world, and in the Homeric epics, the gods, when they go on vacation, they go to the Ethiopians and have a feast with them. So it's a mix, but there is a set of ancient thinking that is kind of parallel to modern racial thinking that very easily can be used to legitimize modern ancient thinking. So that's why I say it's kind of subtle, because it is a weak claim that they make. It's refuted by modern genetic science, but it's the normal way that ancient Greece and Rome have been interpreted. And there actually is some material in ancient Greece and Rome that can be pointed to say that the respected ancient cultures did practice a form of racism that's at least parallel to the kind that we practice now, that therefore, in the view of white nationalist activists, gives it some legitimacy.
One of the, I think, executive summaries of your book could be, people have always been awful. And you go through that a lot. And it was interesting to unpack how far back a lot of this thought process went. And some folks are not interested in learning from that, what that means, and the problems associated with it. One of the things, though, we've been talking for about an hour, and I don't want to impose on too much of your time, although this is a very fascinating conversation. One of the things I'd like to close on is, we've kind of toyed around this a little bit, is the concept of the decline and or the Roman decline. And in your book, you talked about, look, most everybody read Mike Duncan's The Storm Before the Storm. Well, that talked a lot about the decline narrative, right, of the Republic. And then Elon Musk talks a lot about decline. I mean, he talks about how we might need a Sulla, which is kind of frightening, to put it politely. But what is it about that decline narrative that these I'm not lumping Mike Duncan in with that, other than to show how common of a narrative it is. I just want to be clear. I'm not looping Mike in with white nationalist thought. But what is it about that decline narrative that folks like Pat Buchanan and others who have a loud microphone, or at one point did, will latch on to and use? Is it a fear tactic? Is it a scare tactic? I mean, you mentioned Megyn Kelly in one of your recent posts doing the same thing. What is it about that narrative that so makes it such an easy picking for people to go back to?
I mean, the reason I bring up Mike Duncan in my book and many other examples is to illustrate, as you say, that the narratives of decline are very popular for people of all political persuasions. Um, Megyn Kelly does it, Pat Buchanan did it from the right. But all these articles about which Roman emperor is Trump most like, is he more like Caligula or is he more like Nero, right? These critical articles about Trump, those are basically decline narratives from the left, right? Like Trump is the sign of the degenerate dictatorial empire that Rome declined into, and so on. So one point I'm trying to make in my book is that this decline narrative is very popular across the political spectrum. And I do think it's basically a fear-mongering technique. It's basically a way of saying things are really bad and about to get worse if we don't change what we're doing. But one thing I'm trying to say in the book is that even though they're popular with all political persuasions, I think the popularity, whatever side they come from, ultimately serves authoritarian neo-fascist politics. Even a decline narrative from the left, I think ultimately feeds the conditions that, or contributes to the conditions that feed neo-fascist politics. Because the answer to a decline narrative, if we accept that things are very bad and are about to get worse if we don't do something, the answer is almost always we need some strong person, usually a man. We need a strong man to step in and stop the decline and provide rebirth and regeneration for our society. And I think that move in politics, that's people are debating a lot. Is Trump a fascist? Is it appropriate to use that term? The strongest link, I think, between Trump's politics and the true fascist regimes of the 20th century is make America great again. This idea of things are bad and we need an authoritarian leader to step in and stop them. And I think that even when critics of Trump talk about comparisons to the Roman Empire, they're criticizing Trump, but they are feeding the belief that we need to be stopped from decline and restored, which is a central tenet of, you can read historians of fascism. That's a central tenet of fascist politics, is this idea of a need for national rebirth, this promise of the authoritarian leader to restore and arrest decline. So I'd really like to see people give up this addiction to decline as a way of thinking about our contemporary political moment. I'd rather think of it in terms of, take responsibility for our own history. Don't assume a sort of cyclical trajectory of history like these sort of crypto-fascist historians of past ages did, like Spengler and people like that. Yes, maybe there's an intervention needed, but let's think of it in terms of positive growth and change and progress, rather than thinking of it as a decline we need to arrest, because that historically that's just always associated with authoritarianism.
Well, yeah, and certainly I think it's not radical to say Trump is an authoritarian. Fascist is such a loaded
Right.
word. It's got a very complicated definition, I think. But I do think if you operate under the definition that it has to arrive from a democratic movement or at least a democratic republic, then I think certainly, yeah, he fits that bill without question. I mean, look no further than mass people grabbing people off the streets
Mhm.
and very dubious prosecutions of certain people. Um, and the graph,
Sanitizing of history,
uh,
antagonizing political opponent, using government power against political opponents, erasure
yeah.
of history. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parallels.
Well, and the corruption, the graft. I mean, it's just the
Mhm.
way the Supreme Court greenlit that is going to cause us problems for a long time. I do think, though, that you reminded me of this, and I would be remiss if I didn't reference it. Is essentially, if you're trying to think, am I voting for an authoritarian? Say this to yourself out loud and ask if it applies. This is Sideshow Bob when he ran for mayor in the Springfield. Because you need me, Springfield. Your guilty conscience may force you to vote Democratic, but deep down inside, you secretly long for a cold-hearted Republican to lower taxes, brutalize criminals, and rule you like a king. That's why I did this, to protect you from yourselves. If the candidate you're voting for can fit into that rubric, you are voting for an authoritarian.
You might be voting for an authoritarian. Here we got Sideshow Bob on this side quest. I love it.
Well, that and his best line ever, I think, was also from that episode, because that's a whole parody of the right wing political movement, Rush Limbaugh, and all that.
Mhm.
Birchibald T. Barlow is the radio host. And then Bob, of course, becomes famous calling in while he's incarcerated. And Sideshow Bob says, I am presently incarcerated, imprisoned for a crime I did not even commit. Attempted murder. Now, honestly, do they ever give anyone a Nobel Prize for attempted chemistry? But also a great line. Also a great line. So that is interesting that the decline is just a fear-mongering piece of kind of, I guess, people trying to express some of their own unease, some of their own concerns. Woe is me, what's going to happen, instead of, and you talk about this a little bit, which I still, after you open my eyes to the fact that white nationalists do not like Alexander, which I did not have that on my bingo card. That was shocking. Read that in the book, folks. That's interesting. But you talk about taking the classics forward and maybe using it for better examples, finding better ways to use the lessons there to learn from it. And you're talking about that we're talking about that kind of in the decline narrative of embracing this bottom up maybe movement to try to say, well, we can't rely on a Sideshow Bob type to fix things for us. We need to actually take responsibility for ourselves to do this.
Yeah, I think I understand the connection you're trying to make, because a lot of times people ask me, so how can we stop white nationalists using Greco-Roman antiquity, or you know, what can we do about this phenomenon? And in truth, I don't know if we can stop them. I mean, I'm a teacher. I hope a lot of teachers will read my book. Teachers can, and we should, and I try to. We can teach critically. We can, interrogate the assumptions that people make about ancient Greece and Rome. We can teach a more diverse version of ancient Greece and Rome. I say that the white nationalists are not distorting ancient Greece and Rome, but what they are doing is curating ancient Greece and Rome. They're focusing on, politically powerful, male, aristocratic voices who have a lot of ideas that are unsurprising once you see them in that political context. And there's a lot that gets left out. And so, this kind of shows the stakes of studying voices that are marginalized in the ancient sources, of studying the experiences of enslaved people, of foreigners, of women in the ancient world, and recovering those stories and looking at what evidence exists, because that complicates what ancient Greece and Rome is, and sort of decenters the voices that support white nationalist politics. That's a very important thing to do. I try to do it. I hope many other teachers will do it. I hope my book will help people think about the stakes in doing that. Another thing I recommend in my book is sort of learning about and celebrating and holding up and spreading the word about interpretations of ancient Greece and Rome that come from people who have historically been excluded from the discipline of classics. So the interpretations of ancient Greece and Rome by African Americans, the whole rich history of what we call Black classicism in this country. The receptions of ancient Greece and Rome in places other than Europe and the United States, where you find colonized people and formerly colonized people who were often forced by the colonizers to study ancient Greece and Rome, then using and finding inspiration for their own revolutionary and liberatory movements in the classical sources. The more we can study and learn about that, the less or the easier it is to question and recognize the arbitrariness of the sort of sanitized, idealized version of Greco-Roman antiquity that we've all encountered. Those are really important things to do. But ultimately, the dominant and pervasive and most widespread understanding of Greco-Roman antiquity is the one that is congenial to white nationalist politics. And the reason it is dominant and widespread is because those understandings, this is to come back to the idea of white supremacy that we started with, the white nationalist understanding of Greco-Roman antiquity reassures us that the current structuring of society, the grotesquely unjust hierarchical structuring of our current society is the way it should be. That's what ancient Greece and Rome was instrumental in the construction of those hierarchies, and the dominant narratives about ancient Greece and Rome reassure us that those things are the way they should be. And as long as people want to be reassured that things are the way they should be, those representations of the past are going to be popular and widespread. So if we want classics to mean something else, if we want classics to be predominantly associated with something other than white supremacist ideas, then our work should be focused on getting people to reject the idea, to getting people to reject and criticize the way society is currently organized. That might not be a classics project. That is a project of like changing our beliefs about the ideal way that society should be organized and our beliefs about human difference. I organized my book around 6 ideas that white nationalists use Greco-Roman antiquity to support. Those ideas are that violent masculinity is honorable and heroic, that we live in a period of decline and impending collapse, that race reflects biological reality, that white people are superior to other people, that hierarchy is natural and desirable, and that difference produces conflict and violence. Those are 6 ideas that they find ancient sources to support. They're all ideas that the most celebrated classical authors and the most influential interpreters of classical authors have articulated and promoted. So I think the question is, what would classics look like in a world where people rejected those ideas, where people rejected that violent masculinity is a heroic idea, where they refuse to indulge in narratives of decline, when they reject the idea that race is a biological reality, and so on, when they regard hierarchy as violent and unnatural? Change those beliefs in the society? This is a big ask. Change those beliefs, and then we can see what classics means.
Right. And, again, I think, one of the things that we have talked about a lot on this podcast and talk about again is our discussion of topics is often based on value judgments, right? I wanted you to come on here and you were kind enough to come on because I'm making a value judgment to myself. I find this topic interesting, right? And so I want to talk about it. And the other things that you talked about, the hierarchies, those were all value judgments and choices that people made and created something. So when you're thinking about history and when you're thinking about why history is the way it is and how things happen, remember, A, it's messy, and B, it's the result of a series of decisions that people made. If you make different decisions, things could be different. And so I think that definitely should be kept in mind. And as you think about how am I going to engage with this content and how am I going to respond to other people who are engaging it in a certain way and using it in a certain way. Now, last couple of topics here. I like to ask people to suggest a book. It can be a book, any book, any type, any content, subject matter, a book for us to read, and then a recommendation for a future podcast episode. So give us some homework.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna stick to my topic because I learned so much from so many scholars who were working on the histories I'm writing about. So many scholars had done the work to recognize the violence and oppression inherent in classical studies in the past that, in a way, my book is just linking up that scholarship to the contemporary scene. I don't say just, I mean, I think that was a useful intellectual thing to do and a useful historical thing to do, but there's just so many people I learned from. And I want to call attention to one in particular, which is a book called Empire of Ruin by John Levy Barnard. He's a professor at University of Illinois. And this is a book about African American classicism, African American understandings of Greco-Roman antiquity, with an emphasis on the way they used Greco-Roman antiquity to expose the hypocrisy and violence of the way American white supremacists of the 19th century, which is to say, completely mainstream, enslaving Americans, were using Greco-Roman antiquity. It's a really, really good and interesting treatment of how you can use classics to question hegemonic power, to question oppression, and kind of expose the hypocrisy and violence of hegemonic power, especially when that hegemonic power is using classics to support itself. So it's such an interesting and powerful account of amazing intellectuals. Charles Chestnut. These are African American intellectuals. W.E.B. Du Bois, Anna Julia Cooper, Phyllis Wheatley. These are African Americans who knew a ton about ancient Greece and Rome and put it to the kind of political use I'd like to see replace the political uses to which mainstream classics has been put. So that's a really great book. Recommendation for a future podcast episode. It's a little self-serving, although I'm not asking you to interview me, but there's a book coming out which I've contributed a chapter to called the Cambridge Companion to Classics and Race. It's a collection of essays that's a major reassessment of the utility of the category of race for the study of Greco-Roman antiquity. This is a book coming out in 2026, probably spring of 2026, possibly summer. Probably about 25 chapters. It's edited by Jackie Murray, Rosa Andujar, and Elena Giusti. I have one chapter, but what the book is really about is revising the consensus that because race as we understand it is a invention of the early modern period and the transatlantic slave trade and justification of enslavement. The consensus view has been that because race as we understand it is an invention of the early modern period, it's not applicable to the study of ancient Greece and Rome. That ancient Greece and Rome sort of didn't have a concept of race. That's the consensus view. And this book is a galvanizing overturning of that, a demonstration of the it accepts that the early modern concept of race may not be found in the ancient world, but it recognizes all the ways that the idea of race, that is essentializing claims about the nature of groups of people in the service of domination and oppression, is pervasive in the ancient world, has been useful to race pseudoscientists and other white supremacists throughout history. And I think it's just going to make a major contribution to our understanding of the history of race, and a really necessary revision to this kind of I think naive idea that the ancient world existed without race and without racism. And I just think it'd be, to talk to the editors, Jackie, Rosa, and Elena, I think your listeners would be, if they're interested in what I'm doing, they're going to be fascinated with what that book is going to revise about our understanding of race and antiquity.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. If you want to find us online, go to the socials at Antiquity Pod for most of them. You can go to our website, classicalantiquitypod.com. You can call the podcast 540-632-0160. Ask a question, leave a comment. You will get on the air. If you have a question, either I will answer it or perhaps one of our guests will answer it. But again, call. We'd appreciate it. The theme music is by Brent Earhart, and stay tuned, folks. There are more episodes coming. I have to keep doing this because, as you know, the Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.